Bon, bah, bonjour à tous, hein, merci de venir à ce nouveau séminaire en ligne de l'AJEI, Association des jeunes études indiennes. Donc, on connaît a priori, hein, tous les participants ici se connaissent ou en tout cas se sont croisés peut-être un jour ou l'autre dans le petit monde des études indiennes. Donc aujourd'hui, en fait, la séance, on a demandé donc à Lola et Arnaud, hein, de nous parler de la crise du Covid en Inde. Alors Arnaud, avec un collectif de chercheurs, vous aviez déposé un projet.
C'est
Euh,
cela?
Vous aviez un projet pour on travaille sur l'impact socio-économique, géopolitique du Covid sur l'Inde et l'Asie du Sud. Et vous n'avez pas eu ce projet. Donc, tu vas nous parler peut-être de ce projet, dire peut-être ce qui a manqué, etc., les remarques que vous avez eues en retour. Et puis ensuite, tous les deux, vous aviez prévu de présenter les différentes réactions politiques des gouvernements Sri Lanka pour Lola, hein, qui travaille sur les Tamouls, la diaspora tamoule, notamment du Sri Lanka, et Arnaud, lui, qui travaille sur l'Inde, à Göttingen, à l'université de Göttingen, hein, plutôt sur les artisans de l'Uttar Pradesh, si je ne me trompe pas, de Firozabad. Ok, donc Arnaud, je te laisse commencer.
Euh, oui, oui, très bien. Merci de nous avoir invités. Donc, du coup, je suis désolé, je voyais ça comme une table ronde, donc j'ai pas vraiment une intervention formelle. Par contre, j'aurais aimé peut-être continuer commencer sur la situation en Inde avant de parler du projet qu'on n'a pas eu, parce que de toute façon, on n'a pas eu les retours, donc on ne sait pas pourquoi on l'a pas eu. Exactement. Après, de toute façon, il n'y avait que des projets sur la France qui ont été financés. Sauf un projet sur la Chine, sur les marchés, comment dire, les marchés aux animaux sauvages. Et donc, c'était des choses très appliquées. On avait quand même une approche un peu appliquée, mais un peu théorique aussi. Donc, on pense que c'est ça. Mais là, en vrai, on est en train d'attendre les retours des reviewers pour savoir si ça vaut la peine de redéposer le 15 mars un autre appel. Voilà. Donc,
Arnaud, ouais,
oui,
je me permets juste d'interrompre rapide. En fait, Kalik est arrivé et donc Kalik est notre locuteur anglais.
yeah,
Et
okay.
du coup,
Switch to
so I
English.
think we'll switch to English right now. And maybe also if there are some other English speakers
Mm.
who will come, they will not feel uncomfortable. Thank you, Arnaud, for continuing in English.
Yes. So, if I may do, I just wanted to do a very short literature review on what was produced about the COVID situation in India. So, I guess the majority of people here know about what happened in India. So, it was at the beginning a sudden, very strong and extremely violent lockdown. Its main consequences, especially for the ones I know because it's my topic, for the migrant workers who are either for the migrant workers being blocked into the cities with either in shanties or sometimes with a few places to sleep and especially no food because the sudden lockdown, which was decided overnight, has blocked not only their bodies, but also all economic possibilities. For example, with demonetization, no, it's not so. I mean, it's not so easy. It was not so easy for many people just to get their wages already that was due to them. And then they were kept without any assistance in the city because, of course, you had right to rations if you had a ration card, at least for the regions I know, Uttar Pradesh and Delhi. But so many migrant workers had no documentation in the city. So either they stayed in the city being quite helpless and then being totally dependent, not even of government help, but on private help, sorry. So of course, there have been trusts, there have been direct distribution of food. What is important is that actually a lot of researchers made initiatives. I think about, for example, Véronique Dupont in the slum of Katputli, or Rémi de Versegol also made some crowdfundings to distribute food in the Hanuman Mandir Migrants camp in Delhi. And with the University of Göttingen, 2 PhD students Maria Pomoachi and Camille Bua. They were in the fieldwork in Delhi at that time, so they organized an association called Masdor Canteen. And so yeah, they were distributing food with some contacts from the fieldwork to the Masdors, the Masdor, so the migrant workers in North Delhi. And so this is just part of thousands of initiatives that were taken in India, but still these people are in terrible precarious states in the cities. Either they came back to their villages for a majority of them. So it was forced work in the summer already at that time. And yeah, quite some people, I mean, not that many compared to the population of India, but quite some people died of hunger and exhaustion on the way. So I don't spend a long time on this because I think many of you are aware of this situation, and it has been well documented. First by maybe I would advise David Pichry's paper on the conversation, who describes pretty well the situation and also the representation of workers for which the village is the place of identity, the place of safety, and very concretely the place where is the ration card. And he describes the totally paradoxical injunction to stay in the city and not move, and at the same time you have nowhere to dwell or stay at home in the city. And I would also quote from India and Germany the excellent papers that Nitin Sinha did. So Nitin Sinha is a professor at the Leibniz Center for Modern Eastern and Oriental Studies in Berlin. And yeah, you can, I mean, he published a ton of papers in The Wire documenting many aspects of this migrant exodus. So you can just type Nitin Sinha's papers in The Wire. When I still the things about the things published, of course, there was a paper from Rémi de Bersegol and Anthony Goro-Ponceau who compared, in fact, the Hanuman Mandir camp in Delhi and Anthony's place of study, which is a refugee camp, mainly for Tamils and some Tibetans in the Sri Lankan Tamils in Tamil Nadu and close to Pondicherry, and they compared both of constriction of space and of the locking down was negating people's citizenship. Last, there was a kind of generalistic but very good paper by Marine Eldada, Isabelle Guérin, and Mathieu Ferry and Venkat Subramanian, was summarizing a bit the situation on India, the kind of distress that the poor met, and with a focus on debt, because I guess that was Isabelle Guérin's focus or contribution to the paper. And also last, in the political science side, a paper of Jaffrolo and Tucker is also summarizing the stakes concerning operation of higher operation of Muslim, creation of poverty, and so on, of this violent lockdown. To summarize, all these studies have mostly the same conclusion, that this brutal and overnight lockdown and unfought lockdown had a terrible effect on poor people, on also discriminated communities, namely the Muslims and the Dalits. And of course, this is not a rupture. I mean, they all conclude that the COVID crisis and the huge social crisis that is that has brewed at that time and that is still brewing now is only, Jaffrolo uses the term particle accelerator of the metaphor, sorry, is only catalyzation, I would say, of ongoing contradiction, of ongoing discrimination. So basically, it strengthened the inequalities, the class divides, and also the communitarian divide, of course, between the Hindus and especially the nationalists, from people believing in Hindutva, and the Muslims. And also the situation of the Dalits, who may be less silent now, has also quite deteriorated. as poverty in general, because it's the first time with the economic crisis in India that, because before there has always been, since the liberalization, at least of India, a growth which was at the same time enhancing inequalities, but still following the different economic authors, poverty was either reducing or at least staying still. But for economies where inequalities were rising, through the growth only profited mainly to the upper class and the upper middle class. Still, the situation was at the best a bit better, or at the worst still for the poor. And it's the first time that the poor really got poorer in terms of economic indicators. Now I will go back to, I would say, what I know and how it was in my fieldwork. So I work on Firozabad now, which is a cluster. So it's a city close to Agra, and a cluster means that it's specialized in glassmaking. A majority of the bangles made in India are made in Firozabad. It's a kind of low-tech industry. It has been settled there in the beginning of the 20th century by the British, because there was a caste of Muslim glassmakers, the Shishgar, which was implanted in the region already. And so everybody in Firozabad works on glass. So I left the field just because of the COVID crisis, but I continued with Goda Shankar, which works with me as well as with Remy de Bersegol as a research assistant, to make fun interviews on what was the situation. So the lockdown was violent, but not as much as for the migrants, because the majority of Firozabad's workers are still urban dwellers. And through the conditions of work are extremely exploited in the glass factories. There are few slums in Firozabad. There are some migrant workers from the neighboring village, so they came back. But the majority of workers stayed there. They were urban dwellers, so they did not move. A lot of them did have ration cards, so they could have government supplies. And for the other ones, there were food distributions by the industrialists, by the unionists, by the party leaders. Of course, these distributions of food were quite criticized, or at least seen as with a cynical eye by the workers, because I think they rightly thought that any of these actors, in fact, were distributing food on their own expense, but they were seeking, of course, prestige, they were seeking alliances, they were seeking adhesion for people, for viewing after the crisis a better situation of power. Medically speaking, there were several cases of COVID in Firozabad, but it was not that affected. And as far as it goes on people's feeling of the situation, the economic hardship was far, far, far worse than the medical situation. Nevertheless, thanks to the union, they say, or maybe the workers themselves, the wages at the end got paid. Then the people got unemployed for several months, of course. But now the glass industry has taken over, and according to the last reports, there is no crisis anymore. This is quite fascinating, because it means that although the global supply chain have been totally broken, the glass industry has managed to resettle uniquely in the domestic market. So of course, Firozabad being a bangles production city, domestic market has always been strong, but the international market was also something. However, what can explain this apparent absence of crisis at least in a big level, could be the fact that as the weddings and all the ceremonies have been postponed during the lockdown, of course, now there is a huge demand of bangles. If you see the neighboring city of Pordul-Nagar, which is also a glass craftsmanship city, but more specialized in beds, they manage apparently. So some of the bed makers, of the craftsmen, used to be Sabzivala vegetable sellers in the market. They used to go to Delhi just after the lockdown to find employment in the building site, because these beds exportation industry is heavily relying on international trade. But now, being formed again, they manage to, through the contacts, to resettle at least part of their orders in the domestic market. So this is quite impressive. How it happened precisely, I and Goda still have to find out. However, in terms of labor rights, yeah, I try to get quick. Yeah, in terms of labor rights, there has been a big change because in last end of spring, Yogi Adityanath with the government of UP managed to, decided to abrogate the quasi totality of the labor laws. So obviously in UP, it's not to say that the labor laws were respected before. There was huge violations of the labor law. In a city like Firozabad, through the industry is formal itself. The quasi-totality, except the staff or maybe some engineers sometimes of the workforce is informal, is recruited by the jobber system. But through the repealing of labor laws, every workers or unions would say that it helped the industrialists to lengthen the days of work because there were unions, there still are unions in Firozabad, and even though the law was extremely violated before, at least it was a landmark to denunciate, for example, the lengthening of a working day without better wages. Because you could write to the labor commissioner, you could tempt a band or a demonstration or a strike. At least you had a landmark and you had a sign that lengthening a working day till 11 hours, especially without paying extra time wages, was a violation of the law. So now there is no industrial employment crisis as such. The production is going back, especially in the factories as ever. But the main issue of the crisis here has been a strengthening of exploitation through the repealing of labor laws. But what I would say to conclude is that, in fact, still, the situation is not some months after as apocalyptic as we all thought. And yeah, but similarly, and as what was observed in the papers I quoted before, it has been more catalyzing and strengthening, in fact, of a condition of exploitation which already prevailed in Firozabad. Do we have 5 minutes more?
It would be good if we can hear Lola, and then maybe you can answer questions from the audience and make it more of a discussion, because we are 14, so it's a good number to have an interesting conversation, maybe.
Yeah.
So yeah, finish in 1-2 minutes if you can, and then Lola will take the.
So I just wanted to open a perspective by comparing this situation in Firozabad to other places of study of my colleagues, especially the Hanuman Mandir labor colony, where Rémi de Berzegol works. Where the workers are urban, but they are from villages, so they have to move back to villages, then back to the Hanuman Mandir colony, then we find another find work again. And of course, their situation, to the reports I had, was much more precarious, and the lockdown was much harder to bear. And for example, if I quote data, or at least explanation I had about the situation in Kaputli colony, where Agoda also works. There it was more in between situation, because these dwellers are, it's still a famous slum in Delhi. These dwellers are most of them artists, so they have networks, they feel urban, they stay there, and some artists had to shift from artistic activities to, for example, building industry. But still, they did not know the exodus. They did not know such distress as in Katputli, as is in Hanuman Mandir camp. So all this to explain that this strengthening of inequalities can be seen in these three fieldworks in terms of kind of stratification, or at least segmentation. Proletariat, like in Firozabad, has been disturbed. Everybody has been disturbed. It was bad for everyone. But there you can just see more strengthening of exploitation. On urban dwellers, which rely on artistic work, like in Katputli, there is a hard time, but also a resettlement of labor possibilities, but still it was done. And in for urban migrant data, like for example in Hanuman Mandir Migrants, yeah, there was the exodus, the counter-exodus, so we came to much harder situation. So you see that this strength shift of inequality is a bit worsening the situation in every ladder of the Indian society and the Indian informal sector. But of course, the effects were super differential. Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much, Arnaud. So now we'll listen to Lola. Lola, you will talk about Sri Lanka mostly. So that will be interesting for the conversation later on, maybe to have this comparative standpoint. Okay, so you have the floor.
All right, thank you. Yes, I'll talk about Sri Lanka. My current research is not really about the pandemic in Sri Lanka. I'm working, as you said, on Tamil mobilizations in the country and abroad. So I'm not an expert on the topic of coronavirus in Sri Lanka, but I can present a brief overview of mostly the political implications of the management of the pandemic in the country, which we hope could have been developed into a proper research as part of the collective project Arnaud was talking about in case it was accepted, and otherwise that I used to publish a short piece for LISTEM, for the Strategic Research Institute. So as in many countries, but in a way that was probably particularly clear in Sri Lanka, the government has really used the COVID crisis to further its authoritarian role. It has in particular used the pandemic to increase the militarization of the country and of the regime, to weaken the counter powers that are still existing, and to increase the stigmatization and the oppression of minorities. The pandemic appeared in the country when in a context of an authoritarian turn following the presidential elections of November 2019. These elections brought back to power what is usually called the Rajapaksa clan. So you had Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who was elected as president. He appointed his brother Mahinda Rajapaksa, who was himself the president of the country between 2005 and 2015. So he appointed his brother as prime minister, and other members of the Rajapaksa family were also appointed to key positions in the government in a way that really reminds what Mahinda Rajapaksa had himself done during his own mandate. So it's really the Rajapaksa clan that is back to power, we could say. This family, the Rajapaksa family, is known for its authoritarian type of ruling, for its close links with the army, and for its particularly strong adherence to the ideology of Sinhala Buddhist nationalism. So Sinhala Buddhist nationalism is very similar to Hindu nationalism in India. It's a supremacist ideology which equates the Sri Lankan nation with the Sinhalese Buddhist majority only, and which considers the minorities, so the Tamil and Muslim minorities, as second-class citizens, which wouldn't have the same rights as the other. The Tamil and Muslim minorities represent about 11% and 9% of the population, respectively. So in the history of Sri Lanka, there have been repeated waves of violence, including ethnic massacres that have taken place against these two minorities in line with this Sinhala Buddhist ideology. It was also during the mandate of Mahinda Rajapaksa between 2005 and 2015 that the 30 years long war, civil war with the Tamil Tigers, well, the LTT was ended with the massacre of tens of thousands of Tamil civilians. So these are the ones who are back to power now. The return of the Rajapaksa to the government since end of 2019 has put an end, we can say, to the relative democratic openness that the previous government had agreed to, and the very limited but still existing policies of recognition that the previous government was trying to implement. So in this first year of Gotabaya's regime, since 2019, we can see, for instance, that the army has been given an unprecedented role in governance, with many key positions in government being assigned to either current or retired army officers. There's been an amendment to the constitution that greatly expands the powers of the president that has been passed. Political opponents and journalists have been subject to increased surveillance, to intimidation, to arbitrary detention. The efforts that were also taken by the previous government for prosecuting members of the armed forces that are accused of war crimes have all been abandoned, and the investigators of these crimes have themselves been prosecuted by the current government. And finally, the current government has officially abandoned all the commitments that had been taken to the UN Human Rights Council to implement mechanisms of transitional justice. So that's basically the context in which the COVID pandemic started, and the militarization and the communautarisation of the management of the health crisis really needs to be seen as part of this broader authoritarian drift that started with the election of the new government. So after the first cases of local COVID, people being infected, appeared in the country in March 2020, the government implemented very strict health measures with, for instance, the complete closure of national borders that are slowly reopening, but that remain closed for almost a year, and with the multiplication of lockdowns in the entire country. So these measures had a catastrophic impact on the country's economy, because the economy relies mostly on tourism, but it has also relatively well contained the virus compared to the Indian neighbor, for instance. So we can see, I think now there's been about 300 people who died of COVID in total since the beginning of the pandemic in Sri Lanka. So how did they do it? The management of the health crisis was entirely assigned to the army without any institutional decision-making process whatsoever, and without any parliamentary or judicial control whatsoever. So at the head of the main body that has been created to manage the pandemic, so this body is called the National Operations Center for Prevention of COVID-19 Outbreak, there is the commander of the armed forces, of the Sri Lankan armed forces. He's called General Shavendra Silva. And like many other army officers that are now in charge of the management of the virus, Shavendra Silva has been charged with war crimes and has even been banned from the US previously because of that. So those who are now in charge of the COVID crisis are people who were previously being prosecuted for war crimes. And according to several human rights organizations and international lawyers, these appointments are clearly part of an attempt by the government to whitewash the crimes that were committed by the army in the last month of the war, these massacres of civilians that were committed at the end of the war. What this does is also to contribute to strengthening the overall power of the army in the country, in a context which might actually potentially lead to the establishment of a de facto military regime in Sri Lanka. And this is happening while the military presence in the former war zones, so in the northern and eastern provinces, which was the war was taking place, and which are provinces where the majority of the population is Tamil and Muslim, where this military presence since the end of the war is one of the highest in the world, and one that clearly constitutes one of the main obstacles to the post-conflict reconciliation. So you have, according to some studies, you have up to 1 soldier for every 2 or 3 civilians in these in these regions since the end of the war. So since the beginning of the pandemic, the role of the army is really central. It's been responsible for ensuring that the population respects the health-related restrictions. And in this context, it has made thousands of arrests, including by seizing the vehicles of many people without returning it to them. It's also responsible for searching the contact cases. It's responsible for creating and managing quarantine centers to gather people who are suspected of being contaminated. And it's responsible for distributing aid to poor populations, food aid, for instance. Then beyond this militarization aspect, the health crisis has also been used by the government to further weaken counterpowers and political opposition. Since this election in 2019, the government had already shown its preference for what we could call a centralized exercise of power without any real legislative control, because it has in particular appointed or created several ad hoc presidential task forces which have very vague mandates but very extensive powers, and that are not really under parliamentary overview. And in line with this, the COVID crisis was used by the government to justify the complete suspension of the parliament for several months. So you had Gotabaya Rajapakse, who after his election did not have a majority in the parliament, in the assembly. So who after his election, since the first opportunity to dissolve the assembly in March 2020, then he cancelled the elections that were initially scheduled for April because of the health context, but he refused to reconvene the former assembly, the previous assembly, as it would have been required by the constitution. So the consequence was that the government ruled without any legislative oversight through these multiple task forces with vague mandates for several months until elections were held finally in August. The government is also using the health crisis to increase the repression of the political opposition, which is largely already powerless in the prison context, and to silence critiques. Since April, the Criminal Investigation Department has, for instance, officially been responsible for arresting individuals who criticize officials involved in the management of the pandemic, or who are said to circulate false information about COVID, and several of them have been jailed in this situation. Finally, the last point that I'll mention is that the management of the health crisis is also part of the regime's oppression of the minorities, of the Muslim and Tamil minorities. And because of that, it has increased inter-ethnic tensions. So the Muslim community, which is since the end of the war, the new main target of Buddhist nationalists after Tamils after the Tamil minority was crushed. So this Muslim minority, which is also increasingly under risk and particularly threatened since the Easter bombing attacks that took place 2 years ago. It's been accused since the beginning of the pandemic to be deliberately spreading the virus in the country. So these accusations appear in social networks, but also in some official national media. These open accusations, which are also often followed by calls for boycotting Muslim businesses or businesses run by Muslims, have been even reinforced by speeches made by some political figures who also associate the community with the pandemic. Then the stigmatization has gone hand in hand with anti-Muslim discriminatory measures that are taken in the name of the fight against the virus, but really without any scientific basis. In particular, despite the recommendations that have been made by the World Health Organization, which stated that the burial of those who've died from COVID does not present any risk, any sanitary risk, the government has made it compulsory in the country to cremate all those who've died from the virus. I think it's the only country which has done that. And so what happens is that, contrary to the Islamic obligation to bury dead bodies, otherwise the deceased person is considered to go to hell, the government has ordered the forced cremation of many deceased Muslims, and sometimes even of people who are not even known to have died from COVID. So the consequence of that has been that, for fear of being forcibly cremated, some Muslims who were ill with COVID concealed their infection and did not seek any treatment at all. These violations of Muslims' religious rights were perceived by the community, by the Muslim community, as a deliberate violence against them. And they've led to repeated demonstrations throughout the country. In particular, if there are not open demonstrations, but signs of protest, you've got, for months, pieces of white clothes that are used to symbolize shrouds, to symbolize the blanket that is used to bury dead people, have been attached to the gates of cemeteries or official buildings in the island. And in this protest, what is also interesting is that Muslims were joined for once by Tamil political actors as well. And therefore, it has contributed to overcome the historical tension that normally exists between the two communities, which do not often present a common front against the regime. The opponents of these measures have also rejected the government's proposals to export the bodies of deceased Muslims to the Maldives. And these opponents, that was a proposition of the government. And these opponents have denounced in this the symbolic violence of preventing them from being buried in their own country. In response to these demonstrations by Muslims and Tamils, and in response to international pressure to stop this measures, you've had extremist Buddhist groups, including monks, that have themselves organized rallies to demand that the government remain uncompromising on this issue, and thereby clearly helping to further communitarize the management of the pandemic. A last quick point, if I may, this communautarisation has also been seen in regard to the Tamil minority. And the Tamil political actors also perceive the government's health policy as discriminatory towards themselves, towards their community. And their grievances relate to the lack of state aid that has been provided to the Tamil regions in the north and east, compared to the Sinhalese regions in particular. The abuse of soldiers against those accused of violating the lockdown in those regions, in particular the abuse that are committed against members of associations that are trying to provide aid to people struggling. The prohibition of ceremonies to commemorate Tamil victims of the war. These commemorations are probably the most important political act that Tamils are doing after the end of the war. And so their prohibition, despite the fact that health security measures were respected, was really resented by the community. And finally, the requisition by the army of both public and private buildings in the north and east, in Tamil regions, to create quarantine centers was also met with strong local opposition. In a context where you have really increased inter-ethnic tensions, the disproportionate number of quarantine centers in the Tamil regions, also because these are the regions where the military is mostly implemented. So if the military is running these quarantine centers, it will naturally be in the north and east. But it's been seen by the community as efforts by the government to send people infected by COVID to Tamil areas to protect the population in the south, the Sinhalese population in the south, from the risk of contagion. And also as an attempt to further increase the militarization of these regions by seizing even more buildings. I'll stop here. Sorry, I was a bit long.
Thank you very much, Lola. It was a fascinating overview of the situation in Sri Lanka, which we actually don't talk much, at least in the French media. So Lola and Arnaud, now we'll ask you a lot of questions. I think there will be a lot of questions. So we'll take 15 minutes for that. I have some myself, but I will leave the floor to the audience. Does anyone has a question? In case you do, you can either connect your mic and your video, or just your mic, or you can type it in the chat and I will read it. So Cécile, you have a question, but you cannot speak, so maybe you can write it. In the meantime, since you're writing it, I have one question, and to Arnaud and Lola. So basically, so you had a research project and on the impact of COVID, and I think a lot of research groups have crystallized around the issues of COVID in Africa, in South America, in Asia, in India, in China. And my question is, so you all talk about the political impact for Lola because you have more policy approach and Arnaud more sociological approach. Do you think that it will have a long-term impact, or all this is maybe a short-term effects, and maybe they don't really deserve the attention of research, which is mostly researching on long-term phenomena? Do you think it's a long-term, it will have a long-term impact, or a short-term, or it will just be a short-term thing? Arnaud and Lola.
Yeah, start, or as you wish. Yeah, so our project, to summarize in one sentence, COVEMA, it was, or it is if we resubmit it, on the Mediterranean, Asiatic, and European area, analysis of consequences of COVID with three axes. One is geopolitical, second policies, and third one economics and labor. And of course, it starts from the assumption and from the axiom that, yeah, it's going to last for a long time. And if I answer for labor, for me, it's absolutely clear. It's creating huge pockets of poverty, huge pockets of unemployment, not only in India, but also in Europe. As you know, in Europe, it's accelerating the urbanization of the economy, the precarization. In India, I mean, For example, in Uttar Pradesh, so abrogation of 90% of the labor laws. Huh? So the only labor laws that remain, in fact, are the Construction Workers Act, the Workmen Compensation Act. So it just says that if someone is dead, you need, the Bonded Labor System Abolition Act and the Payment of Wages Act. So basically, you have to pay worker. If not, there is no labor right. Do you think that Yogi Adityanath will bring back the labor laws at the end of it will be in his agenda? It won't. And the economic crisis, the huge loss of GDP for India. Unless there are huge social movements, I will see for the farmers. So it may be unrest, and if there is unrest, if there is a social struggle, because I think if we catalyze social struggles, then it may change. But for a neoliberal government like Modi's one, not to mention Adityanath, which is that's personal opinion, but even much worse, to stay in the Indian case, of course, they were only seeking this occasion to strengthen the exploitation of workers and also the deprived communities, first of all the Muslims, and it won't change. There's no reason to change it. Because it's something they wanted to do before, and they always wanted to do, I think.
Okay, Lola, quickly, maybe on because you said there was a huge political impact. I mean, the government has taken advantage of this situation.
Yeah, so of course it's going to have long-term effects, I think, but mostly from the perspective that what has been done to manage the pandemic is really part of a tendency that already existed in the country. So there's no reason why suddenly the government should reverse its strategy and change. The militarization of the regime is underway. The COVID crisis was an excuse to accelerate it, but I don't see any reason why it would change. So it was an accelerator of dynamics that the government would have in any case engaged in. Then you have some other long time consequences that wouldn't have happened at all probably without the pandemic, that are relating in particular to the economic crisis provoked by shutting borders and by stopping tourism for 1 year, which is that the national debt of the country now is so huge that it will probably even rely more on China than it was before. Other consequences might be the even stronger stigmatization of the Muslim community. Now that the virus is actually spreading a little more because you have more and more clusters, we can actually see there's a risk of seeing proper violence against Muslims groups that are accused of being responsible for that. And so yeah, so it can really accelerate dynamics that existed before. A potential positive consequence, the only one that I can see, is this new alliance between Tamils and Muslims that really didn't exist before, and that probably would be a good consequence of the crisis.
Thank you, Lola. So there was a question from Cécile, which is directed at Arnaud. For Arnaud, you were talking about the COVID-19 in India. For example, in South Asia, we see a clear distinction between the lockdown and the post-lockdown, with a situation which might be even worse after the lockdown because there are still some bad economic effects, but lives are supposed to be back to normal. So basically the question is, did you see a difference between during and after the lockdown?
Yes, but I think I partly answered because also Lola, I mean, it's basically we all conclude this. We start from this for the project, but all the papers also, right? It's just an acceleration of what's going on, the neoliberal policies and of some, for example, so in Firozabad, as I said a bit, I think it didn't change so much. It's just that there is more exploitation for workers, more overtime. The fight of, I'm trying, but it's not finished yet, to reconstitute the union and the social struggle history of Firozabad, at least since the 1970s. It's only broad streams I have, but I mean, there are unions before, but still the 70s, the big fight of unions is this overtime, is limiting the time of the day because it's 60 degrees in May inside the factory. It's extremely tenuous work. So of course, it's a very important claim of the workers. And so in the beginning of 80s, they did a lot of strike for this. Very popular leader was assassinated by the goons of factory owner. So then he stopped a bit. So then there was again lengthening of hours. Then again in the 1990s, there were other struggles and so on. So it's like ups and downs of struggle with the unions, between unions and workers and the industrialists. For this main question, the other question of lengthening of hours. So what happens when Adityanath at the level of the state is repealing the labor laws, and at the level of Firozabad, the industries do what they always wanted to do, well, to make the day 11 hours instead of 8 with the same wages. And another consequence was, because there is a fight, I won't enter in details because it's too long, but it's low tech, very low capital input, very low mechanization. And the bangers they are making as the spirals in the factories, they are cut and they are not finished, and they are finished joined in the houses. And they had a machine to automatize the joining. And now there is a struggle by independent unions since the end of the COVID, because of course the owners took advantage of the crisis to furnish themselves in these new machines to automatize the end, and then to suppress employment from the households. So it's just, I mean, basic struggle between labor and capital, but it was a good occasion for capital to, that's it.
All right, is there other questions? If not, I have one more. So I would be very interested in knowing the perception of this crisis in India and Sri Lanka. So we've seen at the beginning of the crisis, when it was the panic in India, there was this Muslim event who was accused of spreading, this Muslim was accused to spread the disease because they had gathered for an event. I think it was Eid al-Kabir or something, this festival, I think. I'm not sure. And Lola, you talked a lot about the minorities, the effect that it can have on minorities. So I'm very curious to know about the perception of this crisis by the local populations. So Lola, maybe with secondary data, and Arnaud, maybe with your first-hand data in the slums. Who was deemed responsible of this? The politicians, the Chinese, the Muslims? Who was the anger directed at? So that's very interesting, I think, to investigate, because it reveals a lot of things.
Indeed, I don't have any first-hand data on that because I was not there. But from what I perceived, and I was pretty surprised at it, is that there's actually not that much anger against the government. The management of the crisis is perceived by the Sinhala Buddhist majority as a real success, and it has even strengthened the power and the popularity of the Rajapakse. This was particularly visible in the legislative elections that were finally conducted in August, where the party of the Rajapakse family won a landslide as it had never. So there's really this perception that the government managed the crisis really well. Now the population is getting really wary at the lockdown, and especially the absence of tourism. So there have been pressures so that borders would be reopened and tourism would start again. And I think there's unrest amongst poor population who have not received any assistance. But otherwise, amongst the really vocal Buddhist groups, who might have been dangerous for the government, there's this praising of the government that is taking place. The anger might happen later on, when the consequences of the economic crisis or felt in a different way. But for the moment, really, there's this nationalist, populist unity behind the government that seems to be taking place.
Arnaud?
Honestly, I really don't know yet because it's I think the name was Tabliki Jamad. But first of all, I mean, the situation for the Muslim was terrible. When I left the field in India, there were the riots not so far from the place where I was living. I mean, so far, maybe 2 kilometers, but still in Delhi. And the day before I left, the last paper I saw, or before I left the field, was accusing the Muslims of Delhi to have self-rioted themselves, weaponized by Indonesian association, which Indonesian association was just giving them money basically to rebuild their houses, which were destroyed by nationalist Hindus. And the paper was saying that, oh, this is the proof that they are piloted by so this was the ambience just before the lockdown. It was absolutely terrible, but it is impossible to know from the kind of fieldwork we are doing right now by phone calls, because this kind of Muslim people, at least in Firozabad, feel cornered, they feel cheated, and they are extremely on defensive, extremely scared. And their feeling about the operation by the Hindus, they will never tell by phone. So when I do a phone interview, it's always, no, there's nothing like community. No, it's not true. Some Muslims have Hindus. There are some Hindus help us. They will not speak up at the phone if they think they may be recorded and all. They're extremely cautious. Like I work with Goda Shankar, is a Hindu, and the main elements I had on the Muslim oppression, it was also even more when the few times I went alone, because what was introduced as Muslims, or if I was Muslim, they were telling me things like, between Muslims, they were dead, we had riots, some people got killed by the Hindus. But so to get this information, I think we have to be in India in the field, because by phone at distance, it's always, I think everybody who's doing field work in India knew that, but communities especially how it is, considering how it is an open wound. The first discourse is like, no, go this way, no, there are problems all over India, but in our community, there's nothing like this. So that's...
All right. Yeah, probably that you need to talk for a long time before you get this kind of information, the real feeling of people. I agree. If no one has a question, it's 2.5, and we pledged we would stick to the timings. So maybe we can sneak in another question if anyone has one. Otherwise, Arnaud, I know that you have a meeting at 2:30, so anyway, we can't be much longer. So I thank you both, Lola and Arnaud, and I think there is a lot of scope for research, and probably there are some, your projects will take another direction maybe, but anyway, I think the work will be interesting. But related to COVID or not, definitely the research orientation you have are actually very interesting. So anyway, I say thank you, and see you next time. Next meeting will be next month on the first Tuesday of March. This session will be is recorded, so just like the last one with Kalik on smart cities, you will be able to view it on YouTube, and those sessions will also be recorded. So here it is, and don't forget to register to the IGEI if you want to participate to the events or participate in the life of the association. That will be our pleasure to welcome you in this association. Okay, thank you Arnaud, thank you Lola, and thank you everyone from the audience.
Bye-bye.
And see you next time.